Secrets of the Forgotten Town. The mysterious disappearance unraveled. Imagine waking up in a town that shouldn't exist. A town where every choice you make is not just yours, but part of a never-ending cycle. What if you couldn't escape, no matter how hard you tried? Dive into the mystery of Black Hollow, where the line between light and dark blurs, and the truth will shock you to the core. Stay tuned, because the twist at the end will change everything you thought you knew. The town was silent. The air was thick, heavy. It smelled like something had rotted, or worse, forgotten. No birds sang. No wind blew. Not a single leaf moved. Jack stood on the edge of Main Street. The buildings around him loomed. Empty windows stared back. His boots crunched on the cracked asphalt. The sound was too loud. A cold chill crept down his spine. He took a step forward. His breath came out in visible puffs. The streetlights flickered, then went out. Suddenly, the silence deepened. Jack paused. His heartbeat thudded in his chest. He looked up. The sky was overcast, but the sun didn't seem to be setting. It was just stuck. Something wasn't right. His footsteps echoed. Hollow, unnatural. Every corner, every alley seemed to stretch on forever. And yet nothing moved. Not a soul in sight. Where was everyone? Where was anyone? He turned toward the diner. Its neon sign buzzed weakly. Jack walked closer. The door creaked when he pushed it open. The smell of stale coffee hit him. The tables were set, plates still full, and yet no one was there. He moved deeper into the room. His fingers brushed against a chair. Cold. A shiver ran through him. A glass of water sat untouched on the counter. The clock on the wall ticked louder, but it didn't seem to be moving. Jack reached for the phone. It was dead. His eyes scanned the walls, looking for any sign. Nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a note, not a trace of anyone. A feeling of dread crawled over him. He stepped back slowly. The door slammed shut behind him. Jack spun around. The street was still empty, except there was something in the distance. A shape, a shadow, a figure standing at the end of the street. It didn't move. It only stared. Jack's throat tightened. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The figure didn't react. The air grew colder. He shivered, and then it began to move. Slowly. It wasn't walking. It was gliding. Closer. Closer. His pulse raced. The sound of his own breathing was deafening. The figure paused. Jack could feel its eyes. Even from this distance, he wanted to run, but his feet felt frozen. A cold gust of wind swept through the street. The figure was almost upon him now, and then it spoke. Leave. The word sliced through the air like a knife. The voice wasn't human. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. It didn't wait. It just vanished. And so did everything else. The town, once full of life, was gone. Just like that. Jack stood in the middle of the street, breathless, frozen in place. The air felt heavier now, thick like smoke. He turned slowly, searching for any sign. But the town was empty. No cars, no people. Just an endless stretch of vacant streets. He shook his head. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare. But it didn't feel like one. His fingers gripped the collar of his jacket. The cold sank into his skin. He started walking again. His steps quickened, but the unease grew with every step. The streets seemed longer. The buildings loomed closer. He could feel their eyes on him, but they were empty. Nothing made sense. And yet, something was watching him. Something close. He stopped at the town sign. It was old, faded. Welcome to Black Hollow. Black Hollow. He whispered the name under his breath. A chill ran down his spine. Why did it sound so familiar? A soft noise broke the silence. A scraping. A dragging sound from behind him. Jack spun around. Nothing. The street was empty. He took a deep breath. And then it came again. A soft scrape. Closer this time. His heart pounded. He moved forward. Faster now. The dragging sound followed him. Closer. Closer. Jack's pulse raced in his ears. He turned down an alley. A dead end. The scraping grew louder. It was behind him. He spun around, heart in his throat. And there, at the end of the alley, the shadow was back. It moved closer. Jack's legs froze. He couldn't run. The figure was closer now. He could see its face. A pale, empty face. Eyes dark as night. Cold. Unfeeling. The voice came again. Leave or join us. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The shadow reached out. Slowly. The air was ice around him. Join us, it whispered again. Jack felt something tugging at his chest. An invisible force pulling him toward the figure. He struggled to breathe, struggled to think, but it was too late. The figure's hand touched his arm. The world went dark, and then nothing. Jack's eyes snapped open. He was no longer in the alley, no longer in the town. He was somewhere else. A vast, dark void stretched around him. A thick fog swirled at his feet. His breath came in sharp gasps. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like he was sinking. The silence was deafening. Then a sound. A soft whisper. Low. Muffled. Unclear. He spun around, searching for the source. And there, in the distance, a faint light flickered. It beckoned him. He took a step forward, then another. Each step felt like wading through thick water. The light grew brighter, but so did the shadows. He could feel them closing in. The fog thickened, swirling faster around him. And then he heard it, a voice. It wasn't the shadows. It was familiar. Jack, his name, spoken softly like a memory. He whipped around, but no one was there. The fog pressed in, suffocating. Another whisper. Closer. Jack, you're not supposed to be here. He spun again. A figure emerged from the mist. A woman, her face pale, eyes hollow. Her voice trembled. You need to leave. Jack's pulse raced. He wanted to speak, but his throat was dry. Choked. The woman's hands reached out. Leave before they come. Her voice was desperate now. The fog grew darker, thicker. A low hum began to pulse in the air. Something was coming. Something hungry. Jack could feel the pull of it. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. The woman's face twisted in pain. I tried to warn them, she whispered, eyes wide. I couldn't stop them. Jack wanted to ask what she meant, but the words wouldn't form. He could feel the shadows now. Closer, closer. The light dimmed. The humming grew louder. Then the woman stepped back. Run, she screamed. But before Jack could react, she vanished into the fog. The darkness pressed in harder. The cold was unbearable. His mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. And then, through the fog, a shape. A silhouette. Slowly it emerged. It was tall, long arms, jagged edges. And then the voice came again. Not the woman's. The same voice from before. The one that had said, "Join us." It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command. Now, you belong to us. The figure moved closer, each step sending a wave of cold through Jack's body. He tried to back away, but his feet were glued to the ground. The shadows wrapped around him like chains. The figure was almost upon him now. Its eyes, black as night, bore into him. A strange pull tugged at his chest, a force he couldn't resist. Join us, the voice repeated. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry. Desperation flooded his veins. He tried to push against the darkness, to fight back. But the air was thick, suffocating. The shadows closed in. Their cold fingers brushed against his skin. The figure loomed over him now, towering. It reached out. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. The figure's hand hovered just above his chest. Then a sharp, agonizing pressure. It felt like something was tearing through him. But it wasn't physical. It was worse. The darkness was pulling him in, deeper, faster. He could feel himself slipping away, vanishing. The figure's voice echoed in his mind. You belong to Black Hollow now. Forever. Jack's eyes widened. He wanted to fight, but there was no fight left. The light around him flickered, then went out completely. The shadows swallowed him whole, and everything went silent, empty, dark. But then, a faint whisper, barely audible, a voice. Don't let them win. Jack's mind tried to hold onto the words, tried to grasp them, but the fog was thicker now. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Only the darkness remained. Then nothing. Time stopped. The void felt endless. A crushing weight pressed against Jack's thoughts. The whisper lingered, faint, almost imperceptible. Fight, fight. Before it's too late. It was a spark, a glimmer, a tiny thread of resistance. Jack's mind reached for it. He had to escape. His body felt frozen, trapped. But his thoughts, they were his own. His breath came in shallow gasps. The darkness pulsed around him, but he held on to that spark. He thought of the town, the faces that were gone, the hollow buildings, the silence that had smothered them all. The woman's voice echoed again, desperate. Fight. His heartbeat, slow at first, began to quicken. He couldn't let them win. The shadows closed in tighter, cold, unyielding. But now, a surge of energy built inside him. A fire. Something was changing. The air around him shifted. The fog started to break apart. Cracks of light appeared, faint at first. He pushed against the darkness with everything he had. The pressure in his chest grew. And then, suddenly, a sharp, blinding pain. It coursed through him like lightning. His body convulsed. His breath caught in his throat. But the light, it grew brighter. The darkness fought back, pulling harder, trying to pull him under. But Jack gritted his teeth. No, he was not theirs. He had to. With one final effort, he pushed forward, and everything shattered. The darkness cracked like glass. A flood of light engulfed him. The shadows shrieked, screamed, faded. Jack gasped for air, his body aching. He could feel the ground beneath him again. The fog was gone. The void was gone. He was back in Black Hollow. But it was different now. The town was still silent, still empty, but he could see something new, something changing. In the distance, something flickered, a faint light. It called to him. Not again, Jack whispered. But it was too late. The town was waking, and he wasn't alone anymore. The light grew brighter. It pulsed alive. Jack felt it pull at him, tugging at the very core of his being. He turned toward it, every instinct screaming to stay away. But something was driving him forward. The silence had returned, but it was different now. He could hear the faintest whispers in the air, the distant sounds of footsteps, soft and shuffling, like shadows walking in the night. His pulse quickened. The air felt thicker now, heavier with a sense of expectation. He took a step toward the light, and then he saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, their faces pale, expressionless. A crowd, hundreds of them, each face familiar, but wrong. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was them, the people of Black Hollow. But they weren't alive. Not anymore. Their eyes were dull, empty, and they were staring at him, silent, watching. His chest tightened. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. They moved toward him, slow, methodical. The light continued to pulse in the distance, and the whispers grew louder. "Join us, join us." Jack's body refused to move. He was surrounded. The figures closed in, their cold, lifeless hands reaching toward him. A chill ran down his spine. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely a sound. I didn't mean to." But they didn't answer. They didn't need to. They just kept moving. And then he saw it. In the center of the crowd, the figure that had spoken to him before. The shadow that had glided toward him in the alley. It was there. Tall, dark, terrifying. Its eyes locked onto his. And that voice. The same voice. "Now you belong." The crowd closed in. Jack's body felt numb. He tried to scream, to run, but the weight of the darkness was too much. The figure's hand reached for his chest. Its fingers were cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. A sharp, searing pain shot through him, and the world around him spun. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were pulling him in, closer, closer. And then the light flickered, and for a moment everything stopped. Jack's mind screamed for escape, but it was too late. The darkness had claimed him, and Black Hollow was his prison. The world seemed to stretch, then collapse. Jack felt himself slipping away. The crowd around him became a blur, their faces twisting in the shadows. The figure, the one with the cold eyes, drew closer. Its hand pressed harder into his chest. The pain intensified, but then a crack, a tiny fracture in the overwhelming dark. A whisper, "Fight." The voice was faint, but familiar. Jack's eyes flickered open. The ground beneath him was gone. He was suspended in that same void, that endless dark. But the whispers, they were different now. Louder, urgent, a voice he knew. The woman. "Jack, you must fight." The pressure on his chest loosened. For a moment, everything went still. The crowd was gone. The figure was gone. Only the voice remained. "Do not let them take you." Jack's breath came in sharp gasps. His heart thundered. He could still feel them, the shadows, but they were farther away now. A new light flickered in the distance. Not the pulsing light, but something else. A warmth. Hope. Jack's body felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, to reach for it. He took a step, then another, and another. The whispers grew louder, urging him on. "Fight, Jack. You are stronger than they know." His legs felt weak, his thoughts blurred, but the light, it called to him. Closer. It was no longer a distant glow. It was right there, within reach. Jack's fingers brushed the light, and then, with a sudden rush, the darkness shattered. The fog, the figures, the cold, all of it broke apart like shattered glass. The shadows screamed as they dissolved. And Jack was free. His mind spun. His vision blurred, but the light surrounded him. He felt alive again. The whispers faded. A deep, almost peaceful silence settled in. Jack's eyes opened wide. He wasn't in Black Hollow anymore. The town was gone. The streets, the buildings, the empty faces, they were all just memories now. He stood in an open field, bathed in soft moonlight. The air was clean, fresh, and then, as if in a final echo, a voice, familiar yet distant, whispered one last time. "You can never truly escape, Jack. But you've won for now." The light around him flickered once more, and then everything went dark, and Jack was alone again. The silence pressed in around Jack, suffocating. His breath caught in his throat as the darkness seemed to fold around him once more. But this time it felt different. It wasn't as oppressive, not like before. There was no cold, no whispers, no figures watching from the shadows. Still, something was wrong. The air smelled stale, like old, forgotten things. He stood alone, surrounded by nothing but the void. But then, something shifted. A faint sound in the distance. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A voice. A voice he recognized. "Jack, you can't leave." His heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was hers. The woman who had warned him. The one who had told him to fight. She was here. Or was she? The air shifted, cold and sharp. The ground beneath his feet trembled. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape, but the sensation of being watched returned. That all too familiar, suffocating feeling. He spun around, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of life. But there was nothing. Then the voice came again, clearer now. "You can never leave this place, Jack." His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. The darkness around him began to twist. Shapes moved within it, just out of reach. A shadow flickered, and then a figure. The same figure from before. The tall one with hollow eyes. It was standing before him now. Jack's body froze. It reached out, and once again he felt that icy grip on his chest. The cold seeped into his skin, into his bones. He gasped for air, but none came. "You thought you could escape," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in the void. "No." Jack managed to whisper back, his throat raw. I'm free." The figure laughed, a low, chilling sound. "Not yet, Jack. Not yet." The shadow grew larger, looming over him, casting a deep, suffocating darkness. And then another voice, softer. "Jack, don't listen to it." Jack's head snapped around. There, in the distance, a flicker of light, a small, pale figure standing in the dark. It was her again, the woman. "Fight," she urged, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You're not like them. You can break the cycle." Jack's chest heaved with a sudden surge of panic. The darkness was pulling at him again, the shadows creeping closer, their cold breath nipping at his skin. But the light from the woman called to him. It felt real. It felt like the only way out. He took a hesitant step toward it, and the shadows moved faster, closing in around him. "No," the figure growled. But Jack wasn't listening anymore. He ran. The darkness clawed at his heels, but the light was brighter now, guiding him, urging him forward. "Don't stop," the woman's voice rang out in his ears. Jack pushed harder, his legs burning. The shadows reached for him, but this time he fought back. With every step, the void receded. The cold light grew stronger. He wasn't going to be taken again. Not this time. And as the darkness threatened to engulf him once more, he reached the light. And in that final moment, he felt the pull, an overwhelming rush, like he was being torn apart. But there was no turning back. The light consumed him, and everything stopped. The darkness was gone. The world shifted violently, spinning around Jack. One moment, he was falling into the light. The next, he was standing still, breathing, alive. The void was gone. The crushing weight was lifted. Jack looked around. It was different now. Not empty, not silent. He stood in the middle of a vibrant forest. Tall trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped in the distance, their song soft and soothing. The air was warm, comforting. But even with all the peace, Jack's heart raced. He wasn't sure what to think, what to feel. Had it all been a dream, a twisted nightmare? But no. He remembered the cold, the shadows, the whispers, the suffocating weight of Black Hollow. This was not a dream. And then a voice, a familiar voice, soft and clear, calling his name. "Jack." He spun around. The woman stood before him again. She looked different now, no longer a shadow of despair, but alive, vibrant. Her eyes, once hollow, were now full of warmth. "I told you," she said gently. "You can't escape. Not yet." Jack's breath hitched. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman's gaze softened. The light wasn't your escape, Jack. It was the beginning. She stepped closer, her presence filling the space around him. This place you're in, it's not real. It's just another layer. Another layer? Jack's mind reeled. No, he whispered, shaking his head. It can't be. I'm free. I'm out. The woman's expression turned sad. You're free from one prison, yes. But this is just the next. The real game is about to begin. Jack's stomach twisted. But why? Why all of this? Why me? Her eyes darkened slightly. Because you're part of something much bigger than you realize. Black Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a test. A trap. Jack's head swam with confusion. A test? A trap, he muttered. For what? She looked at him, her eyes piercing his soul. To see if you were strong enough to survive. To see if you could face the darkness inside of you. Jack staggered back, his heart pounding. He couldn't breathe. The shadows had never left. They were still with him, lurking, waiting for his next weakness. And then, a sickening realization. He wasn't free. He never had been. The forest, the peace, it was all an illusion. The woman's smile faded. Now the real choice begins, Jack. He looked at her, dread crawling up his spine. You're either part of the light or part of the darkness. The trees around him began to twist, their shapes warping into something darker. The warmth began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming cold. And in the distance, he could see the figures once again. The same hollow eyes, the same whispers. They were back, and this time there was no escape. The woman's voice echoed one final time. Make your choice. The darkness around Jack thickened. The warmth faded completely, leaving only a biting chill. The figures, no longer just silhouettes in the distance, moved closer. Their faces twisted, distorted, as they loomed toward him. The woman's presence began to fade as well, leaving Jack alone in the growing cold. Make your choice, she repeated, her voice now distant and echoing as though from another world. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. The shadows crept closer, their cold fingers reaching for him. The same feeling of suffocating pressure he had known in Black Hollow wrapping around his throat. The ground beneath his feet shifted again, as though the very earth was alive, pulling him into the depths of its grasp. He could feel it. The darkness was alive, hungry. It was searching for him, seeking his weakness. He fought to stay upright, his legs unsteady, his mind reeling. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. But the woman's words echoed in his mind. Part of the light, or part of the darkness. He didn't want to be part of the darkness. Not again. Jack clenched his fists, a surge of determination flooding his body. The figures closed in, the shadows' whispers growing louder, mingling with the deafening sound of his heartbeat. He had to make a choice. He couldn't just stand there, helpless. He closed his eyes. Asterisk no more. Not again, asterisk. A sharp pain pierced through his chest, like a knife twisting inside of him. It was the same feeling he'd had in the void, only stronger now. The shadows were trying to claim him again, pulling him deeper. But Jack resisted. The whispers swirled around him, drowning out his thoughts. Don't listen to them. He opened his eyes, his vision blurred by the pain. But he saw the light again, the flickering warmth, far in the distance. It wasn't as far now. It was closer. He had to choose. Jack moved toward the light, pushing past the shadows that reached for him. He could feel them tugging at his body, could hear their cold, relentless whispers in his ear. Join us. His mind screamed for him to turn back, but he kept moving forward. With every step, the pain intensified. His vision blurred more. The darkness closed in around him. And then, for a moment, everything stopped. The cold, the whispers, they vanished. The light surrounded him, flooding every inch of his body, filling his mind. His skin felt warm, alive. But it was different now. The light wasn't pure. It wasn't comforting. It was a choice. Jack stumbled forward, the weight of it all sinking in. He had crossed the line. The line between darkness and light had never been so thin, and now he could feel it. The pull, stronger than anything he had ever felt. Jack, the woman's voice again. Her figure appeared before him, but her face was different now. No longer warm, no longer alive. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her eyes empty. He nodded, though fear gripped him. She smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. "You're not free," she whispered, fading into the light. The shadows had been his test, the light his choice. But neither of them was salvation. Jack stood alone, suspended in that fragile space between them. The light flickered, then dimmed. Jack stood in the stillness, suspended between two forces. The shadows still lingered on the edges of his mind, whispering, promising peace in exchange for surrender. The light, however, felt more like a weight, an impossible weight pushing down on him, suffocating him with its endless pressure. The warmth was gone. The choice, now clear, was no longer a choice at all. "Jack," the voice came again, soft, but sharp as a knife. "You cannot stay in the middle." The woman's voice, distant, yet piercing through the haze, was filled with something darker now, something final. He turned toward the sound of her voice, but all he saw was the growing void of darkness creeping toward him. "Choose," she urged once more. "You cannot stay here, suspended between worlds." He wanted to speak, to protest, to scream, but his throat was tight, suffocated by the weight of the decision pressing in on him. The choice was his. It always had been. The darkness, the light, both had offered him something. One promised an end, the other a beginning. But what was the cost? Jack's chest tightened as the shadows reached for him again, this time quicker, more determined. The whispers became a roar, a steady, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the very air around him. Join us. Join us, asterisk. His legs shook as the pull of the darkness seemed to wrap around him, its cold fingers sinking into his skin. He looked once more to the light. The warmth still flickered, distant yet close, a strange contrast to the crushing weight of the darkness. "You cannot escape," the woman whispered. "Not here. Not now." And then it happened. The final, terrifying truth unfolded in front of him. The shadows and the light were not two separate things. They were one. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the light shattered, fracturing into a million pieces. Each fragment was like a shard of glass, sharp and jagged, reflecting his deepest fears. The darkness poured through the cracks. It didn't swallow the light. It became the light. Jack's mind screamed in confusion. This was not what he had imagined. This was not the choice he had prepared for. "You belong to us," the shadows spoke in unison, their voices weaving together in a chorus that rattled his bones. And suddenly he knew. The woman wasn't a guide. She wasn't a savior. She was a part of this, a part of the cycle. The light, the darkness, the town, the test. It was all the same. The cycle had never ended. It had only begun again. Jack felt himself being drawn into it, his body pulled toward the infinite whirlpool of shadow and light. The whispers, the voices, everything blurred. "Join us," they repeated, but this time Jack didn't resist. He couldn't. As the last shred of light faded into the darkness, Jack understood. There was no end. There was no escape. Only a beginning. And the cycle would start again. The pull was relentless. Jack's mind screamed, but his body felt numb, as though it were no longer his own. His thoughts scrambled in the chaos of the merging light and shadow. He had always believed that one would consume the other, that the light would banish the darkness or vice versa. But now he understood. It was never a battle. It was a fusion. The light didn't vanquish the darkness. It became it. And the darkness, it didn't erase the light. It embraced it. Jack felt himself drawn deeper into the swirling mass, his body spinning through the void, his senses assaulted by a new kind of awareness. One where there were no distinctions, no boundaries between light and dark, no good or evil. It was all one. He could feel the voices now, not just the shadows' whispers, but the light's hum. Two, they mixed together, indistinguishable, and they filled his mind, his heart, his very being. They were no longer commands, no longer pleas. They were understanding. The confusion that had once plagued him, about Black Hollow, about the town, about the choices, began to fade. It was as if all of it had been a test, but not one of strength, not one of willpower, not even one of survival. It had been a test of his acceptance. He was part of it now, a part of something much larger than he had ever realized. And then suddenly everything stopped. The darkness, the light, the voices. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He was back in the town, Black Hollow. The buildings were no longer decayed. The streets no longer empty. People, real people, breathing, living, walked past him. Their faces, once vacant and hollow, now full of life. But Jack knew. He knew the truth now. This wasn't the town he had left behind. No, it wasn't the town he had tried to escape. It was a new beginning, the beginning of the cycle, and he was at its center. He could feel the weight of it. Everything that had happened, every step he had taken, had led him to this moment. The people around him were familiar, but they weren't quite right. They were real, yet they weren't. They were part of the cycle, too. And so was Jack. He walked through the town, but it felt like he was walking through the pages of a story that he couldn't escape, a story that was destined to repeat itself over and over again. The woman's face appeared in front of him, not as a figure in the distance, but standing right there in front of him. She smiled, her eyes glowing with an eerie warmth. "You've made your choice, Jack," she said softly. "But remember, this is only the beginning." Jack's heart stuttered. Before he could say anything, she vanished, leaving him standing in the midst of the bustling town. The hum of the lights, the sound of footsteps, the murmur of conversations, everything was alive. Everything was real. And yet, Jack knew it would all happen again, and again, and again. The cycle, the darkness, the light, the choice, it would always come back. He was trapped in it. And as the people around him continued to live, to breathe, to walk by, Jack realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just a part of the cycle. He was the cycle, forever. And when it began anew, as it always would, Jack would be the one to make the choice again. The town, Black Hollow, pulsed with life, but it felt hollow in a way Jack could not explain. It wasn't just the buildings or the people, it was him. He was part of it now, and the knowledge sank into his bones like a heavy weight. His footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement, but it was as if the sound didn't belong to him, as if he were walking through someone else's memories. Jack's chest tightened. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But the faces around him were too familiar. They were him, and he was them. Their eyes glinted with a strange knowing, as if they could feel the cycle starting again. His hands trembled, and for the first time since he had woken up in the forest, Jack wasn't sure where he ended and the town began. It was as if he was being woven into the very fabric of Black Hollow. And then it happened again. The figure appeared before him, tall, shadowed, its eyes as black as the endless night. It wasn't the same as before, yet it was. It stood there, just beyond the edge of his vision, like a familiar presence that couldn't be shaken. "You're still here," it whispered. Its voice was colder than anything Jack had ever felt. "I thought," Jack stammered. "I thought I was free." The figure's lips twisted into something like a smile, but it was twisted and hollow. "You were never meant to be free," it replied, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate grace. "You are the beginning and the end, Jack. The story starts and ends with you. Always." The words burrowed deep into his mind, and Jack felt them gnaw at his soul. He tried to run, but his body wouldn't move. His legs were frozen, locked in place. "Stop," he gasped, feeling his breath catch in his throat. "Why?" the figure asked, tilting its head as if in mock curiosity. "It's already begun." Jack closed his eyes, desperate to block out the figure, to block out the knowledge that was slowly drowning him. But the moment he did, he saw it. The endless loop, the people, the whispers, the cold, endless darkness. It stretched before him, weaving into the light. The warmth, the chill, the faces, the voices, all of it connected. He was stuck in it, trapped in the cycle. The figure's voice, now a low murmur, reached into his mind. "You were never meant to escape. You were always going to be the one to decide when the cycle begins again." Jack's chest constricted. He opened his eyes again, and the town before him blurred into something he could barely recognize. The people walked past him, but their eyes, they weren't the same. They were waiting, watching. He realized then that they weren't truly living. They were part of it, too. And as he watched, the scene around him began to unravel. The streets cracked open like the surface of a frozen lake. The buildings split in two. The ground trembled. Jack could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, swirling through the air, through his thoughts. "Choose," they whispered. But this time, there was no escaping the truth. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't deny it. This was what he was always meant to be. The cycle was endless. He was part of it. He had always been part of it. And when the town fell away, when the buildings crumbled and the faces turned to shadows, Jack knew he would be the one to build it again, to decide, to begin, again, and again, forever. The cycle had no end, no escape, and Jack was at the center of it all. The town trembled beneath Jack's feet, the world shifting, warping around him. He could feel the weight of the cycle pressing on his chest. It was suffocating, inescapable. The faces around him, those living, breathing people, began to twist again, their expressions warping into the same hollow, empty stare he had seen in Black Hollow before. They were all waiting, watching. For him. Jack staggered back, his mind reeling. His breath came in ragged gasps. He wanted to run, to break free, but no matter where he turned, he was still there, trapped in this endless loop of light and shadow, life and death. The air grew thick with the whispers once more, each one rising to a crescendo, crashing through his thoughts like a wave, drowning him in its cold, relentless pull. "Choose." The word echoed in his mind, reverberating through his skull. His body tensed. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was stuck in place, pinned beneath the weight of his own existence. "No," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. I won't do it." But the town around him didn't care. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending together into a chorus of demand, a relentless chant. Asterisk, you must choose, asterisk. Jack felt his knees buckle, the ground beneath him giving way. He fell to the pavement, his hands scraping against the rough surface. His skin burned, his bones ached. He was suffocating in the darkness that wrapped itself tighter around him. And then, in the midst of it all, there was a flash of light, a single pulse of warmth, cutting through the oppressive cold. It wasn't the same flickering light that had haunted him before. This light was pure, blinding, all-encompassing. It washed over him, filling the air with a hum that resonated deep within his chest. He looked up, his eyes stinging from the intensity of it. And there, in the center of the light, stood the woman. Her form was no longer a shadow, no longer an illusion. She was real. She was tangible. And she was waiting. "Jack," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange weight now. "You know what you must do." He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, terror, and desperate longing. "I can't," he managed to choke out. "I can't keep doing this. I can't be a part of it." The woman's expression softened, but there was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. "You've always been a part of it," she said, her voice like a whisper in the wind. "And you always will be." Jack's chest tightened. The light around him pulsed once more, stronger now. The shadows seemed to retreat for a moment, but only for a fleeting second before they crept back. Choose asterisk, they whispered again. The voice of the darkness was now cold, hard, and final. Jack clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't know how long he had been standing there, caught between the light and the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. Every inch of his body screamed to break free, to run, to escape. But there was no escape. There never had been. The town flickered around him, the faces of the people shifting, melting like wax under the pressure of time. They were all waiting for him to decide, waiting for him to make the choice that would reset it all. His breath slowed, his thoughts becoming clearer. He was no longer afraid. He understood now. The cycle would never end, not until he made the choice. And no matter what he chose, no matter how much he wanted to fight it, the light and the darkness were the same. They were two sides of the same coin. Jack reached out a trembling hand toward the woman, the light, the warmth. He wanted to choose. He wanted to believe that the light would be enough, that it could end the cycle, could stop the suffering. But deep down, Jack knew there was no end, no true escape. The choice was his, and it was always the same. So, with trembling hands, Jack made his decision, and the cycle began again. The moment Jack made his choice, the ground beneath him shattered, the light exploding into 1,000 pieces, scattering like dying stars. The very air around him began to warp, twisting as the world around him melted into a blur. The cycle reset. The pain, the weight of the decision, faded for a moment, only to return, stronger than before. Jack felt himself falling, but there was no fall. There was no descent, only a sudden, suffocating stillness. He opened his eyes. The world had changed again. The buildings of Black Hollow loomed before him, as familiar as they had always been, yet somehow different. The people, those same faces, those same hollow eyes, moved through the streets in a strange, detached rhythm. The air was thick, the sky hanging heavy above him, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The whispers started, low at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "Asterisk, you've chosen asterisk," they murmured, the voices echoing like a chorus of lost souls. "You've always chosen." Jack's heart raced in his chest. He looked around, but the faces remained the same people, the same patterns. Nothing had changed. The cycle had begun anew, and he was at its center. His body trembled, the weight of it all crashing down on him. "Not again," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, not again." But it didn't matter. The cycle had no mercy. The woman appeared before him once more, but she was no longer the guide, no longer the distant figure he had once looked to for answers. She was a part of it, too, a part of the endless loop that Jack could never escape. Her eyes were as empty as the faces around him, and yet there was something different in her gaze, a recognition, an acknowledgement. "You've chosen Jack," she said, her voice filled with a quiet finality. "And this time, you must understand." "Understand what?" Jack's voice cracked as he tried to make sense of the words. "What's happening? Why can't I leave?" The woman's expression softened, but there was no pity in it, only resignation. "The light and the darkness are not what you think they are," she said softly. "They are not separate forces. They are one, Jack. And you are the key." Jack staggered back, his legs buckling beneath him. His mind spun. The town, the people, everything was a part of this. He was part of it. He had always been part of it. "What do you mean?" he whispered. "What do you want from me?" The woman stepped forward, her form flickering like the last remnants of a fading flame. "Nothing. Not from you," she said. "But you... Jack, you want to understand. You want to escape. You want peace. But peace cannot exist without the cycle. It cannot exist without the choice." Jack's chest tightened. His thoughts were spiraling, crashing into each other like waves against rocks. The darkness, the light, the choice. They were all part of the same thing, the same never-ending dance. And no matter how hard he fought, no matter how far he ran, he would always be drawn back into it. "No," Jack gasped, his voice cracking. "I can't. I won't do this again. Please, I won't choose." The woman's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Jack could see something beyond the endless cycle, something raw and untamed. "You have no choice, Jack," she said, her voice now cold. "You never did." And just like that, the cycle began again. The shadows closed in, the whispers grew louder, and the faces of the people, once again, grew blank. The town blurred around him, and the familiar suffocating pressure returned. But this time, Jack wasn't afraid. He couldn't be. There was no fear left. The cycle had him, and it would never let go. The pressure of the cycle was all-encompassing, a constant hum that resonated through every fiber of Jack's being. His body no longer felt like his own, but a mere vessel, trapped in the endless loop. The town, Black Hollow, surrounded him again unchanged, as though time itself had never moved. The faces of the people were the same, empty, blank. Their eyes followed him, but they saw nothing. They were part of it, just like him. Jack tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the ground, bound by some unseen force. "Not again," he whispered, but his voice was barely audible, swallowed by the oppressive silence. He wanted to scream, to run, but the cycle held him in its grip, an unyielding force that he could neither escape nor understand. The woman's figure appeared before him once again, like a shadow in the distance, her presence more overwhelming than before. She looked at him, her eyes full of something, maybe pity, maybe something worse. "You thought you could escape," she said, her voice echoing with an almost mournful undertone. "But this is what you are." Jack felt his chest tighten. His heart began to race as the realization settled in. This was his fate, to be a part of this cycle, a never-ending dance of light and darkness, creation and destruction. He wasn't just a player in it, he was the cycle itself. "You think you're trapped," the woman continued, stepping closer, her presence suffocating. "But you are the trap." He wanted to argue, to lash out, to fight back against the words that clung to his mind like shadows. But the truth, bitter and cold, gripped him tighter than the cycle ever could. There was no escape. There had never been any, not for him. "You were born to choose," she whispered, over and over again. The light, the dark, the beginning, the end. Jack's mind spun, the weight of the words crashing down on him. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost. There was nothing to say anymore. No more protests. No more fights. This was his purpose, his reason for existence. The cycle would continue, with or without him. "Why?" Jack whispered, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. "Why me?" The woman's smile was faint, but there was no warmth in it, just a cold knowing. "Because you chose," she replied simply, "and now you are bound. Bound to the beginning, bound to the end. It will never change." He closed his eyes, but the truth was there, following him. It seeped through every crack in his mind, filling him with the awful, suffocating knowledge. There was no way out. There had never been. Jack opened his eyes again. The town before him seemed to blur, its edges warping, twisting like smoke in the wind. The people, the buildings, the sky, they all seemed to fade into something darker, something deeper. And yet, the cycle remained. It would always remain. "You're not alone in this," the woman said softly, her voice almost a whisper now. "We're all here. We've always been here." And as Jack's vision faded, the cycle reset once more, pulling him back to the beginning. The town, the faces, the whispers, everything reformed, just as it had before. And he knew he would be there again, in the center, waiting to choose once more. But no matter what he chose, no matter how hard he tried, it would never end. The cycle was eternal, and Jack was its heart. The cycle had become a part of Jack, an inescapable truth that settled deep within him. It wasn't a force he could fight, nor could he outrun it. It was woven into his very essence, like the pulse of a heart, constant, relentless. The town, Black Hollow, remained unchanged. Every time the cycle reset, the people returned, their faces as hollow as before. The streets, the buildings, the sky, they never shifted. They never aged. They remained in their loop, their timeless pattern. Everything felt familiar. Too familiar. Jack stood in the middle of it, his body frozen, as though it belonged to the cycle. Just another part of the machine that never stopped turning. His thoughts screamed for an escape, but there was no exit. There had never been one, not for him. The woman's figure appeared before him again. Her presence was no longer an intrusion. It was part of the rhythm, part of the dance. She looked at him with those empty eyes, not cold, but knowing. She understood, and for the first time, Jack realized she had never been his enemy. She was simply another aspect of the cycle, just as much a prisoner as he was. "Jack," she said, her voice soft, almost tender. "You finally see it, don't you? The cycle isn't just a trap. It's the only truth, the only way things can be." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He could no longer fight it. There was no fighting it. The beginning, the middle, the end, it was all one, all connected. "This is it," she continued, her voice echoing like a song, both haunting and beautiful. "You're the key, Jack. You always were." A surge of realization washed over him, both frightening and strangely comforting. The cycle was him, and he was the cycle. The choices, the darkness, the light. He was both the creator and the creation, the start and the end. And as the town began to fade around him, Jack understood that he wasn't bound to a never-ending loop. He was the loop, and now he would carry it forward, forever. The cycle had not claimed him. It had made him its keeper. And in the silence that followed, Jack's last thought was not of escape. It was acceptance. The cycle would continue, but Jack, at last, was free. The world around Jack began to fade once more, the town of Black Hollow dissolving into nothingness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was weightless, suspended in an endless space of quiet stillness. The cycle had run its course, its rhythm still echoing through his mind, but now there was no tug, no pull to force him back. His body, though still, felt alive with the energy of everything he had endured. The darkness and the light, the endless choice, they no longer weighed on him. He had stopped resisting, stopped fighting against the inevitable. The woman appeared before him, as she had so many times before. But now there was no emptiness in her eyes, no distant, unreachable knowledge. Instead, her gaze was soft, almost peaceful. "You've found it," she said quietly, her voice no longer an echo, but a calm, grounding presence. "You understand now Jack looked around, his eyes scanning the empty space. It was neither bright nor dark, just a neutral quiet. For the first time, he wasn't trapped between two forces. He wasn't caught in a loop. He was simply present. "I understand," Jack murmured, his voice clear and steady. The words didn't feel like a burden anymore. They felt like release. The woman nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "The cycle is not a prison. It is a path, a journey of understanding. And you've reached the end." Jack took a deep breath, the first breath that felt like it was truly his own. He had spent so long believing that he was a pawn, that the choices were never his. But now he saw it. Asterisk-y asterisk had always been the one to shape the cycle, to guide it forward. Not as a victim, but as its creator, its keeper. "Then it's over," Jack said, a sense of calm settling over him, spreading through his chest like warm sunlight. The woman nodded, her form beginning to fade. "Not an end, Jack. Just a beginning." And as she disappeared, Jack realized that she was right. This wasn't an ending, but a final turning of the page. The cycle would continue, yes, but it was no longer something to fear. It had become part of the fabric of the universe. Part of him, woven into existence itself. With one final, deep breath, Jack closed his eyes, letting the quiet wash over him. And in that moment, everything was still. Everything was whole.